From North Vietnam, Mr. Xuan Thuy. He arrived in May 1968 when the talks opened. Since then, he and his colleagues have been joined by representatives of the Viet Cong, led by Madam Thai Binh. From the United States, Mr. Henry Cabot Lodge, one of a list of high-level diplomats who have handled the grueling negotiations on behalf of the nation most anxious for peace in Indochina. And inside the conference chamber, already at the table, Mr. Pham Dang Lam from South Vietnam. In over 150 such meetings, what have they achieved?
Most historians agree that the Vietnam War began in the 1950s. North Vietnam would be backed by the Soviet Union, China, and other communist countries. South Vietnam would receive backing by the United States, South Korea, and other anti-communist countries. The United States would become more involved with the war on March 8, 1965, by sending its first batch of combat troops to fight the war.
My family included my mother and dad, and I have a brother and sister. My brother is just a year younger than I am, and my sister is 6 years younger. My family was from Alabama, but we lived in Illinois almost all my life. I think growing up was a normal going on. My dad worked in the steel mill, so he worked on a swing shift, so every 10 days he would shift from days to afternoons to nights. It also involved one long strike that was over 116 days long, where things were a little rough during that time. My family would go Illinois back down to Alabama to visit my grandmothers. One lived in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and the other lived in Scottsboro, Alabama, on a farm. So that was something that we always looked forward to go down south and see them.
The Draft Lottery, a live report on tonight's picking of the birthdays for the draft.
I was drafted. They reinstituted the lottery in that year, the very first year of the reinstitution. They drew numbers for each of the birthdays, and my number was 114, becoming involved in war, but my family had always believed that I was going to be called upon to go in the Army. I didn't relish becoming involved in war, but my family had always believed that you had a service requirement, and so it wasn't as if I didn't think that it was a justifiable thing. I looked at it as it was a lottery. There was a lot of people that were able to avoid being drafted, and for whatever reasons, and some of those reasons weren't all that good. I guess I looked at it as my duty. You get the idea that the Army is different as soon as you are involved with the processing in. My very first day in the Army involved 6 o'clock in the morning getting on the Illinois Central to go from suburbs of Chicago to downtown Chicago, having physicals and getting some first shots, and then getting on a plane. And our first landing was in Alaska. We got out of the airport while they refueled and did whatever they were doing, but they didn't tell us we couldn't go anywhere. But when you're in Alaska at an airport and it's October and, you know, 0 outside, there wasn't a lot of places you could go. So we got on that plane and took off again. I got to Vietnam and it was morning time. But you did meet some of the soldiers going home, and they were happy and talking about how short they were. And it was somewhat difficult when you knew that you had the whole 365 days to go. So they would, of course, be very happy because they and drinking and waiting to go home, and there wasn't much that could down their spirits. Vietnam, got on the fire base, got in my company, got in my platoon, a weapons platoon, 25 people. The funny thing about a lot of them is that I don't remember their real names nearly as well as I remember, you know, because we had a guy named Dingo, we had a guy Fat Dog. You remember the names that you called each other more than you remembered anything else. My name is Wally, and I weighed 140 pounds, so I was Wally TT, and we had a guy named Wally Bartnick, and he was Wally Buku, because he weighed about twice as much as I did. So again, Bartnick I knew, I guess, more because he came later and he was a good friend of mine. And anyway, we had a number of different people, and you got your names. There was the medic you'd call Doc, just because almost any medic was called Doc. I was a mortar man. I was, at the time when I went over, I was a PFC. I was had been a college student. I was a very good math student, so I usually ran the plotting board, which was a matter of taking the map and the readings that we had and determining where our position was, have plotted areas, and we would set up the mortar to be ready to fire if we had a fire mission. When we'd go out on patrol, you would carry either a piece of the mortar or you would carry mortar rounds. We fired illumination rounds and we fired HE rounds. The other part is I still carried an M16, and we went on missions where we would go through the jungle, and an average day was just like that. That's the same. I mean, it would depend on, again, if we were in the mountains, then you didn't move as far because it was hard to travel around. If you were in an area where it was mud, rice paddies or whatever, you moved a lot slower. And places that you knew from experience were places they might put booby traps. The area of Vietnam I was in was very, very well known for booby traps. For one thing, if the Viet Cong fired at us, they knew that we would call everything we had to go after them, and we had a lot more weapons than they did. So if they fired and we knew where they were, and typically if you have an idea where they are, and you'd just blow the heck out of them. The children, ages probably from about 5, 6 to about 11, 12 years old, frequently are at the gates around our fire base selling things that they got on the black market. If you wanted beer or pop, that wasn't something you could get where I was. I mean, there was no such thing as a PX where I was. You have to go to the rear. But the kids had it. Now those same kids, if we were someplace within 10 or 12 clicks, they would actually go out in the bush and find us and bring that beer and pop. And they would also sell noodles, bananas, little tiny bananas, and different things like that. They would usually hang around with us during the day. At nighttime, they'd have to head back and go back to their villages. One particular time, I guess we were out not too far, and when they got there, they found us. We were pretty far back, and they came in, and they said, 10 baby son come out, 9 baby son go home. One of them had been blown up in a booby trap. So $13 for pop didn't sound nearly as expensive when you realized how hard it might be to get it there.
On this edition of Vietnam Report, elements of the Army's 9th Infantry Division conduct combat sweep operation in the Mekong Delta's Dinh Quang province.
Because we were mortars, I was supplying support for the platoons that were out someplace else. So they came in face to actual Viet Cong more often than I did. I mean, most of my coming into contact with either somebody had fired something from out of the dark into our area or the booby traps. When we had our 4 days off, we might spend it walking to Duck Bow. Their Duck Bow was a more secure area, having some better food and entertainment. They would bring some Philippine or Australian groups over, and that's where I would see some sign of back in the world. I'm 100% disabled because of Agent Orange.
Agent Orange is a herbicide used by the United States military to destroy forest cover. The military would spray over 20 million gallons of herbicides in Vietnam. The code name for the attacks were Operation Ranch Hand. Operation Ranch Hand was executed by mostly aircraft that dropped herbicides onto the ground. While the herbicide worked, it would have massive side effects on our troops deployed in Vietnam. Some side effects include Hodgkin's, Parkinson's, leukemia, and several more.
They just presumed that you were exposed to it if you spent any time in Vietnam. But I spent my full year, and I was out in the bush. Agent Orange probably did more damage. It's hard to say. Those people that got killed, they did more damage to the people that lived than that managed to not get killed by Viet Cong and whatever. I did leave the unit 2 months early because they needed somebody that could type. I broke my rule. I volunteered to type. I sounded a lot better than trudging around with a mortar and a M16 in the middle of the jungle. So I was there for the last 2 months that I was there in putting my fingers to use. But I still pulled duties and guard duty, and I wasn't a model soldier, so I did not have spit-shine boots. I couldn't believe those guys did that were on the fire base. They did it so they could get better guard positions, you know. Vietnam, the last day was just the reverse of coming over. I got back to Cam Ranh Bay, the same place I had taken off from. The only difference is I'm one of those guys yelling short. Landed in Seattle, Washington. I got off at the same base. It was, when I got there, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I get my uniform, and then I got a cab, took it to the airport, and took the first flight to Chicago, and called at the airport, called my wife and told her when I would get to O'Hare, and took off, and so that was the last day. There were always are people that have feelings that are honest, but I think most of them just didn't want to go is why they. I really, truly don't believe that it was more than that. Now, there were honest people. Some people just don't like war, no matter who it is, when it is. But I also think they're wrong. A lot of people say many times that we lost the war. We did not lose the war in Vietnam. The people that say that don't understand the real history. They signed an agreement. The war was over. We won. I am one of the few people that actually know when you bring it up, you find somebody that can find the history and prove me wrong. You won't, because that's not what happened. We won. We never fought any major battle over there that we didn't win. Not only didn't we just won, we won big. People that said things, but you know, you can't jump off at every single person. So I went back to working at the Chrysler plant in Belvedere, and those guys are, hey, They accept you like in the Army. Went back to school, I didn't really say that much about the service. I mean, it wasn't something that I figured was going to make a lot of happiness. So my family treated me fine. My sister had American flags all over the place, and she was spectacular. I came home in '71, so 46 years later, I've had a heck of a good life. Now, part of it I always felt is because I worked hard for it. I see a lot of people not allowing people to speak. And I think that you gotta let people speak, and then you decide which way you want to go. It's one of the things that I think is the worst part of the generation. You can do right things and still come out with bad outcomes, but you can't let that stop you from trying to do the right thing.
This being my second year in the program, I feel more attached to veterans than I ever have. I feel like last year I definitely begun appreciating everything, but this year has really cemented everything as I became more involved within the program. Originally, I wasn't gonna take the class. Last year, I felt like I did what I wanted to do. That's chapter closed, on to the next, but I just felt the pull to come back and work on another documentary. And during the process of picking out my vet, I found Walter Watson, and I always been fascinated by the Vietnam War and the stories the soldiers went through. Watching through and knowing all the things that the Vietnam soldiers went through, it makes things a little more personal. Sitting through and listening to Walter's interview, I definitely could imagine myself being there along with him. Throughout the years, it's become publicly known of the Vietnam War and doesn't really get scrapped under the table as through things such as media like movies, games, everything you can think of really sort of fantasized the war. But being able to hear it from a veteran really makes it more grounded, makes it more human. All the nights I stayed here after school until 6 to 7 p.m. was all for veterans. There's no selfish reason, nothing. It's just because the impact this program has on you just pushes you more. You don't really do it because you want to, it's because you feel you need to. You want to make these people's lives more special. And I feel like that's definitely the power it comes from Vet Doc, is to be able to connect one person to another on such a deep level. Thank you for your service, Walter. Thank you for having such an incredible impact on my life, and I just wish you the best.